The folding chair wobbled every time Garnett Whitten shifted his weight. He'd been sitting in the back row of the county courthouse for 40 minutes, and the metal legs had found a groove in the old hardwood floor that made the whole seat rock like a boat in shallow water. He planted his boots flat and held still. The room smelled like floor wax and old radiators. About 40 people were scattered across the rows, mostly farmers in canvas jackets and seed caps, plus a handful of out-of-town investors with clipboards and pressed khakis. The October light came through the tall windows and fell across the room in long, pale bars, catching the dust that floated up every time someone shifted in their seat. Floyd Clance stood behind the oak podium at the front, running the auction the way he had for as long as anyone in the county could remember. Floyd was a thin man with a voice that could fill a barn, and he used it now, rattling through parcels the way an auctioneer does when neither the land nor the crowd has given him reason to slow down. A half-acre lot behind the gas station went for $1,200. 3 residential lots on the edge of our town sold together for $4,000. A bankrupt grain operation north of the highway drew some interest before the bidding settled at $31,000. Garnett watched all of it the way he'd spent 35 years watching land change hands in this county, with patience, with attention, and with the quiet confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was waiting for. In the third row, a man Garnett had never seen before sat with a leather clipboard balanced on his knee. He was maybe 55, silver hair, cut short, wearing a sport coat that looked like it cost more than most of the land being sold today. He had a spreadsheet printed out and clipped to the board, and he made neat check marks next to each parcel number, as Floyd called them. Garnett noticed he hadn't bid on anything. He was shopping, but nothing had caught his eye. The man's name, though Garnett didn't know it yet, was Rayford Bumgarner. Floyd turned to the next page of his list and cleared his throat. Parcel 17, 40 acres, Section 12, Township 84 North. He read from his sheet without enthusiasm. Property is classified wetland, mostly standing water, delinquent on taxes since 2014. Starting bid is $185. Nobody moved. Floyd looked up from his paper and scanned the room. $185 for 40 acres. Do I have a bid? Silence. In the second row, a farmer turned to his neighbor and whispered something. The neighbor shook his head. Folks, that's less than $5 an acre, Floyd said. Anybody? In the third row, Rayford Bumgarner glanced at his spreadsheet, found parcel 17, and wrote 2 words in the margin past wetland. He flipped to the next page. Garnett raised his hand. Floyd's eyebrows went up. I have 185 from the gentleman in the back. Do I hear 200? Nobody spoke. The room was quiet enough to hear the radiator clicking. Sold, Floyd said, and brought the gavel down. $185 to Garnett Whitten. A few heads turned. Garnett nodded once, pulled a checkbook from the breast pocket of his flannel shirt, and wrote the check right there in his seat. His hand was steady. His heart was going fast, faster than it had gone in months, but his hand was steady. In the third row, Rayford Bumgarner turned around and looked at Garnett for exactly 2 seconds. His expression didn't change, but his eyes did what experienced investors' eyes always do when something unexpected happens. They recorded. Then he faced forward again, opened his clipboard, and wrote a small note at the bottom of Parcel 17's entry. He considered it for a moment, then drew a single line through it. Not important, not yet. Garnett drove home that afternoon with the deed in the glove compartment of his truck. The roads were quiet. October in Iowa has a way of emptying the landscape, pulling the color out of the fields and the people off the highways, leaving everything still and gray and waiting for whatever comes next. The house was quiet when he walked in. It had been quiet for 18 months, ever since Ottilie died. Her reading glasses were still on the kitchen counter, right where she'd set them the last time she came downstairs to make tea. Her garden journal was still on the table, open to a page she'd been writing on the last morning she was strong enough to hold a pencil. Garnett had not moved these things. He was not the kind of man who built shrines, but he was the kind of man who understood that some objects hold their place because moving them would mean admitting that the person who put them there is truly gone. He set the deed on the kitchen table next to the journal and looked at them side by side. Then he picked up the phone and called Eunice. His daughter answered on the second ring. She lived in Des Moines and sold real estate, which meant she had opinions about land purchases, the way surgeons have opinions about cuts. Strong ones, professional ones, the kind that left no room for sentiment. "Hey, Dad, what's going on?" "I bought some property today." "Property?" Her voice sharpened. "What kind of property?" 40 acres out past the old highway, came up at the tax auction. There was a pause. Eunice was good at pauses. She used them the way other people use questions, as pressure, as a way of saying, "I'm waiting for the part that makes sense." "How much?" she asked. 185. $185,185. Another pause, longer. Garnett could hear her breathing change. "Dad, what is it? What's on this land?" "Right now, water mostly. Cattails, some brush. You bought a swamp." "I bought 40 acres for $185. Dad, there's a reason nobody else bid on it. 185 for 40 acres means the land is worthless. It means even at that price, nobody wanted it." "I wanted it." "Why?" Garnett looked at Ottilie's journal, at the page where her handwriting curved across the paper in lines that still looked alive. "I have my reasons." "Dad?" Eunice's voice tightened. She had Ottilie's voice when she was worried, the same pitch, the same way the words got shorter and harder at the edges. "This is what I've been talking about. Mom's been gone a year and a half, and you're out there alone making decisions like this. Buying swampland at a government auction. It sounds like dementia buying Dad. That's what it sounds like." The words hung in the kitchen like something dropped from a height. Garnett let them hang. "I'm fine, Eunice. You're 73 years old, living alone, and you just spent money on 40 acres of mosquitoes and mud. I'm worried about you." "Don't be. Can you return it? Is there a cooling off period?" "I don't want to return it." She sighed. It was the sigh she used when she knew she wasn't going to win, but wanted him to know she hadn't given up. "We're going to talk about this more." "We can talk about it whenever you want," Garnett said. "Won't change anything, but we can talk." After he hung up, he sat in the kitchen for a few minutes, listening to the house. The furnace cycling on, the refrigerator humming. The clock on the wall that Ottilie had bought at an antique store in Amana 20 years ago, its tick steady and patient and completely indifferent to whether anyone was listening. Clovis called 20 minutes later. Garnett's youngest was 38, lived in Omaha, and worked for a company that did something with computers that Garnett had never fully understood. Clovis was the family's comedian, the one who smoothed rough edges with jokes, who turned conflict into punchlines, because punchlines were easier to hold than feelings. "Eunice says you bought a swamp," Clovis said. Garnett could hear the grin in his voice. 40 acres. Dad, you bought a mosquito farm." He laughed. It was a real laugh, warm and incredulous. $185. You couldn't buy a decent riding mower for that. "What are you going to do with 40 acres of swamp farm, Dad? It's underwater." "Not for long." Clovis laughed again, but softer this time. Something in Garnett's tone had landed. "You're serious." "I am." "Okay, well, just be careful out there. You're not 25 anymore." "I'm aware." Odell, the middle son, sent a text message. Odell was 43, lived in Cedar Rapids, and worked as an accountant. He was careful with words the way he was careful with numbers, spending each one deliberately and never using two where one would do. His message said, Dad Eunice told me about the land. Can we talk about this when you have a minute? Garnett typed back, nothing to talk about, but I appreciate you asking. That was the end of the conversation, at least for the moment. Garnett knew his children would circle back. They always did. Eunice would bring spreadsheets. Clovis would bring jokes. Odell would bring questions that sounded neutral, but were really measurements, each one calibrated to determine how far off center his father had drifted. Ottilie had kept the journal for 40 years. Every page held notes about what she planted, what bloomed, what failed, what came back stronger the next season. She pressed flowers between the pages, petals flattened into thin, translucent membranes that still held their color years later. She sketched garden layouts with a drafting pencil Garnett had given her for Christmas in 1986. And scattered throughout between the planting records and the dried petals, she wrote about a place she remembered from childhood. The spring. Ottilie grew up 2 miles from those 40 acres on a farm her parents rented from a man named Rackley. As a girl, she used to walk through the fields to a spot where cold, clear water bubbled up through cracks in the limestone bedrock. Her grandmother Zella had taken her there. Zella's mother had gone there before that. The spring had been running for as long as anyone could remember, and the land around it was the most fertile ground in the county. Then in 1963, the county rerouted a drainage channel to make way for a new stretch of highway. The water table shifted. The 40 acres flooded. The spring disappeared under 2 feet of standing water, and within a few years, the land was nothing but cattails and mosquitoes and silence. Everyone who remembered what it had been either moved away or died. Everyone except Garnett. He got up from the table and walked down the hall to his home office. It was a small room, barely big enough for a desk and a filing cabinet. Ottilie used to call it his cave. The filing cabinet was olive green, 4 drawers, the same one he'd had since 1978. Garnett opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a manila folder. Inside were 2 photocopied survey maps. The first was dated 1958, 5 years before the drainage project. It showed the 40 acres in detail, contour lines, soil classifications, water features. A blue circle marked the limestone spring. Handwritten notes in the margin read, Soil Class 1, Glacial Loam Deposit, 12 to 18 inches topsoil. Natural spring flow estimated 3 gallons per minute. That soil had taken 10,000 years to build up layer by layer as glaciers retreated and left behind the richest agricultural earth on the continent. It was the kind of ground that could grow anything you put into it, and it had been doing exactly that for 100 years before the county drowned it. The second map was dated 1964. Same 40 acres, but the contour lines were different now. The spring was gone from the map. The soil classification had been changed to wetland non-productive. A note in red ink said, Drainage reroute complete per county resolution 47-63. Garnett had copied these maps himself in 1972 when he was a 20-year-old clerk at the county surveyor's office. His boss told him to box up the old paper maps for storage as the county transitioned to a new filing system. Garnett photocopied the ones that interested him before they went into the basement. Nobody noticed. Nobody cared. 54 years later, those copies were the only record of what the land had been before the county flooded it. The originals were probably rotting in a government basement somewhere if they hadn't been thrown away entirely. Garnett set the maps on his desk and studied them the way he had dozens of times before. The spring location, the soil depth, the drainage routes. He'd spent 35 years reading land for the county, and this was the clearest story any piece of ground had ever told him. The land wasn't dead. It was buried. The spring was still down there, pushing water up through the limestone the way it had for centuries. The soil was still there under the muck. All someone had to do was put the drainage back the way it was supposed to be, and the land would come back. Ottilie had known this in her way. She didn't have survey maps or soil classifications. She had memory. She had her grandmother's stories and her own barefoot afternoons at the spring filling mason jars with cold water and carrying them home through the tall grass. Somebody flooded the prettiest 40 acres in the county, Garnett, she used to say. Somebody should bring it back someday. She'd said it so many times over 52 years of marriage that the words had worn a groove in his memory. On summer evenings when they sat on the porch, on winter nights when she flipped through her journal and touched the pages where she'd written about the spring. Even near the end in the hospital bed they set up in the living room when her voice was barely a whisper and she held his hand and said, "Promise me you'll take care of my garden." He didn't know if she meant the backyard garden with the tomatoes and the marigolds, or the one she'd been carrying in her imagination since before they met. Maybe both. That evening, Garnett sat at the kitchen table with the journal and the survey map spread out in front of him. He picked up a pencil and started drawing drainage lines on graph paper, working out the angles and the grades, calculating where the water needed to go and how to get it there. He worked until midnight until the pencil went dull in his hand, and by then he had a plan. By 6 the next morning, he was standing outside the hardware store waiting for the doors to open. The clerk was a young woman with her hair pulled back under a ball cap. She watched him load a cart, 2 shovels, a pickaxe, 50 feet of 4-inch PVC pipe, a post hole digger, duct tape, work gloves. "Building something?" she asked at the register. "A garden," Garnett said. She looked at the pickaxe. "Must be some garden." "It will be." He paid cash, loaded the truck, and drove out to the 40 acres. The October morning was clear and cold, and the standing water on the land had a thin skin of ice at the edges where the shadows fell. Garnett pulled on his rubber boots, the same ones he'd worn for field surveys, caked with mud, from 100 different properties over 35 years. He tucked his pants into the tops and grabbed a shovel. The plan was simple in concept. He needed to dig a channel along the south edge of the property about 2 feet deep and 18 inches wide, running 300 yards east to the county drainage ditch that fed into the creek. Once the channel connected, gravity would do most of the work. The water had nowhere to go right now because the 1963 reroute had cut off the natural drainage path. Garnett was going to reconnect it. He started digging at 7:15 in the morning. By 9, he had cleared about 15 feet of channel. The work was slow and brutal. The soil was waterlogged and every shovelful weighed twice what dry ground would. His back tightened after the first hour. His hands blistered inside the gloves by the second. He stopped to rest every 20 minutes, sitting on an overturned bucket he'd brought from home, drinking water from a thermos, and looking at the long stretch of ground still ahead of him. By noon, he had 30 feet of channel and a body that felt every one of its 73 years. Garnett found the fracture. He set the blade of the shovel into the crack at a precise angle, braced his weight against the handle, and pushed. The stone separated along its natural line, splitting into 2 clean halves that he rolled aside with his boot. 2 minutes. A younger man without the technique would have spent half an hour with a sledgehammer. Garnett looked at the 2 halves of the stone sitting in the mud, and for a moment he felt something he hadn't felt since Ottilie died. Satisfaction, the quiet kind that comes from knowing your body and your mind still work together the way they're supposed to. He was 73 years old, and his knees ached, and his back was stiff, and the October cold bit through his jacket. But his hands still knew how to read stone, and his eyes still knew where to look, and that counted for something. It counted for a lot. By the third morning, though, the satisfaction had burned away, and what was left was arithmetic. 45 feet of channel in 3 days, 300 yards to go. At this rate, 3 weeks for the main channel alone, and that was before the lateral branches he'd need to drain the interior sections. His lower back had seized up so badly after the second day that it took him 10 minutes to straighten up after sitting on the bucket. He stood there in the channel, bent at the waist like a man looking for something he'd dropped, waiting for his spine to release, and he understood with perfect clarity that he could not do this alone. He just didn't know who was going to help. The answer walked up the gravel shoulder later that afternoon. Garnett was knee-deep in the channel shoveling mud when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned and saw a young man standing at the edge of the road, hands in the pockets of a canvas jacket that was too thin for October. He was tall, maybe 6'1", with a lean build and brown hair that needed cutting. He looked about 25. His boots were worn but cared for. His hands, visible even from 20 feet away, had the kind of calluses that come from years of physical work. His eyes were tired, but they were steady. "You need a hand," the young man called out. Garnett straightened up, pressing one hand against his lower back, and studied the man the way he studied land, taking in the details, reading the story. "Depends," Garnett said. "You looking for work?" "I'm looking for anything." "What's your name?" "Shelby, Shelby Petway." "You from around here?" "Grew up about 10 miles south. Been living outside town since the elevator closed." Garnett knew about the grain elevator. It had shut down 6 months ago when the company consolidated operations. 40 people lost their jobs. Half of them left town looking for work elsewhere. The other half were still here doing what Shelby Petway was doing right now, walking county roads looking for someone who needed a strong back and didn't ask too many questions. "You got experience with this kind of work?" Garnett asked. "I spent 4 years loading grain trucks and fixing conveyor belts. I can dig a ditch." Garnett nodded. $15 an hour. "Okay, you show up at 7, you work it till I say we're done. I'll provide the tools." Shelby didn't hesitate. "I'll be here tomorrow." "Be here now," Garnett said. "There's an extra shovel in the truck." Shelby climbed down into the channel, took the shovel Garnett handed him, and went to work without another word. They dug side by side for the rest of the afternoon. Garnett didn't talk much. He showed Shelby the drainage plan, pointed at where the channel needed to go, and let him work. Shelby was strong and fast, and he didn't complain about the cold or the mud or the water seeping into his boots. By the end of that first day together, they had cleared twice what Garnett had managed alone in 3 days. "Same time tomorrow?" Shelby asked, wiping mud from his face with the back of his hand. Shelby walked back toward the road. He didn't have a car. He'd been walking the county road looking for day labor when he spotted an old man working alone in a swamp. That took either desperation or something else, some instinct that said this was worth stopping for. Garnett watched him go and figured it was both. That evening in Des Moines, Eunice Slagle sat at her kitchen table with a glass of wine and her phone, and she did something she would later wish she could take back. She called Rayford Bumgarner. Eunice knew Rayford through the real estate network in central Iowa. Everyone did. He was the kind of investor who showed up at every tax auction, every foreclosure sale, every estate liquidation within 100 miles. He bought low held until the market moved and sold high. He was good at it. He drove a black SUV and wore sport coats to auctions, and he always did his homework. Eunice called him because she wanted a professional opinion. She wanted someone in the business to tell her what she already believed, that her father had made a foolish purchase, that the land was worthless, and that she was right to be worried. "Rayford, do you know anything about Parcel 17, Section 12, Township 84 North? My father bought it at the auction today." She heard Rayford shift in his chair, heard papers rustling, 40 acres of wetland, he said. Standing water, no agricultural value, no development potential. Your father got the best possible price for that land, which is to say he still overpaid. That's what I thought. Eunice felt the tight knot in her chest loosen slightly. Professional confirmation. She wasn't being paranoid. Thanks, Rayford. No problem. Give your dad my best. She hung up. She felt better. She shouldn't have. Because on the other end of the line, Rayford Bumgarner set down his phone and opened his clipboard to parcel 17. He looked at the 2 words he'd written that morning, Passin Wetland, and he looked at the single line he'd drawn through them. Someone had asked him about that parcel twice in one day. First, the old man at the auction, who raised his hand without hesitation. Now the old man's daughter calling to ask if her father had lost his mind. Rayford Bumgarner had made a career out of noticing when other people knew something he didn't. He pulled the line through his notes, tapped his pen against the clipboard twice, and then opened his laptop. He typed in the parcel coordinates and hit enter. At the same moment, 20 miles away, Garnett Whitten sat at his kitchen table with Ottilie's garden journal open in front of him. The pressed aster was still tucked between the pages about the spring. Purple faded to brown, its petals thin enough to see through. He didn't know when Ottilie had put it there, but it had been there for years, holding its place the way some things do when nobody moves them. He touched the flower with his thumb gently, the way you touch something that belongs to someone who isn't coming back. Then he turned to a clean page of graph paper, picked up a freshly sharpened pencil, and kept drawing drainage lines. There was a channel to dig. There was a spring to find. And somewhere out on the dark Iowa highway, Shelby Petway was walking the 2 miles back to his rented trailer, already thinking about tomorrow morning, already wondering what the old man in the swamp was really building. Over the next 2 weeks, Garnett Whitten and Shelby Petway fell into a rhythm that neither of them talked about, but both of them needed. Garnett arrived at the land every morning at 6:30. He unlocked the tailgate, set out the thermoses, 2 now. 1 coffee and 1 water, laid the tools along the shoulder of the road, and walked the property alone in the gray pre-dawn light, checking the channel, reading the ground, planning the day's work the way a general reads a battlefield before the troops arrive. Shelby showed up at 7. He walked the 2 miles from his rented trailer on Decker Road, and Garnett could track his approach by the sound of his boots on the gravel, steady and unhurried, the pace of a man who has nowhere else to be and has made peace with that fact. Shelby never said good morning. He picked up a shovel, dropped into the channel, and started digging. Garnett did the same. They worked in silence for the first hour, and the silence was comfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who understood that conversation was optional, but the work was not. The channel grew. 50 feet, 100, 200. When they connected the first section to the county drainage ditch on a cold Thursday morning, the effect was almost immediate. Water that had been sitting on the south end of the property for 60 years began to move east through the channel, slow but steady, pulled by gravity along the path Garnett had carved. By the next morning, the standing water on the south quarter had dropped an inch. By the end of the week, 2 inches more. Garnett taught Shelby to read the contour of the land, to see where water wanted to go and where it was being held against its will. Shelby picked it up the way some people pick up music, not by studying the theory, but by listening to the instrument. He had good instincts for terrain, and he asked the kind of questions that showed he was thinking about the work, not just doing it. They were setting PVC pipe for a lateral drain on a Tuesday morning when a county pickup truck pulled off the highway and stopped on the gravel shoulder. The driver's door opened, and a man climbed out who looked like he'd been built from the same material as the Iowa landscape, thick-weathered, permanent. His name was Lamar Bostick, and he was the county's water maintenance supervisor, responsible for every drainage ditch, culvert, and retention basin in the township. He had hands the size of shovels and a face that hadn't smiled since the Clinton administration. Lamar walked to the edge of the property and stood there looking down at the point where Garnett's channel met the county ditch. His jaw tightened. "You tied into my system," Lamar said. His voice was flat. "You tied into the county drainage system without talking to me." Garnett climbed out of the channel and stood on the bank. Shelby stayed where he was, shovel in hand, watching. "Lamar, I'm putting water back where it was already going before the county moved it. I don't care where it was going before. I care about who connects to my infrastructure without filing a single piece of paper. You know what happens if the flow increases and the ditch overloads? 3 farms downstream flood, and guess whose phone rings at 2 in the morning?" Garnett looked at him for a long moment. Lamar wasn't wrong. The man had a legitimate concern, and Garnett had ignored it because he was in a hurry and because he'd spent 35 years in this county thinking of its drainage system as something he understood better than anyone alive. Which was probably true, but that didn't give him the right to skip the conversation. "Come to my house tonight," Garnett said. "I'll show you the original survey maps. The flow I'm adding is less than a third of what the natural drainage carried before the reroute. Your ditch was designed for that capacity. It can handle it." Lamar looked at Garnett. He looked at the channel. He looked at the water moving through it slow and steady and clean. 7 o'clock, Lamar said, "and this better be good." It was good. That evening, Garnett spread the 1958 map across his kitchen table and walked Lamar through the original drainage pattern, tracing the water's path with his finger the way he'd traced it 1,000 times in his mind. Lamar studied the map for 20 minutes without speaking. He was not a man who gave ground easily, but he was a man who respected evidence, and the evidence was clear. "Your numbers hold up," Lamar said finally. He set down his coffee cup. "But next time you talk to me first." "I will." Lamar nodded, once stood up and left. Not a friend, but no longer a problem. Except that Lamar Bostic was a county employee, and county employees talked to other county employees, and within 48 hours, his report about Garnett Whitten and the unauthorized drainage connection had landed on the desk of Bethel Presley. Bethel Presley was the chair of the County Board of Supervisors, and she arrived at the property 3 days later in a county vehicle with the seal on the door. She was in her early 60s, silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, wearing a county jacket with the logo embroidered on the chest. She had the posture of a woman who had spent her entire career being the only woman in rooms full of men and had learned that standing straight was a form of armor. She stepped out of the vehicle and walked to the edge of the property, her boots sinking into the soft ground. She looked at the drainage channels. She looked at the exposed dark soil where standing water had been a month ago. She looked at Garnett, who was standing in the channel with mud on his arms and his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. "Garnett Whitten," she said, "you're altering water flow on federally classified wetland without a permit." Garnett set down his shovel. "I'm restoring the original drainage pattern, Bethel." "Doesn't matter. This land has been classified wetland since 1964. You need a Section 404 permit from the Army Corps of Engineers before you touch any waterway on this property. I could issue a stop work order right now." Garnett knew Bethel. More importantly, Bethel knew Garnett. 20 years ago, her husband had disputed a property boundary with a neighbor, and Garnett, then a senior surveyor, had been called in to settle it. Garnett's measurement showed that Bethel's husband was wrong, that he'd been farming a strip of land that belonged to the neighbor for 15 years. The neighbor won. Bethel's husband lost 2 acres and a grudge that he carried to his grave. Bethel never said a word about it to Garnett, but she never forgot it either. "I have documentation showing the county caused this flooding," Garnett said. If you issue a stop work order and I file an appeal, the county will have to explain why it destroyed 40 acres of prime agricultural land without compensation. That's a conversation the board might not want to have. Bethel's expression didn't change. She was too experienced for that. But something shifted behind her eyes. A recalculation, the kind that happens when a person realizes the ground they're standing on isn't as solid as they thought. 2 weeks, she said. You have 2 weeks to file for a permit review. After that, I send the order. She got back in her vehicle and drove away. Shelby climbed out of the channel and stood next to Garnett, watching the dust settle on the gravel. She mean it? Shelby asked. Garnett picked up his shovel. She means it. So what do we do? Garnett looked at the land. The water was receding every day. The ground was firming up. Somewhere beneath the mud and the cattails, a spring was waiting to breathe again, and he had 14 days to find it. We dig faster, Garnett said. The next Monday morning, Shelby didn't show up. Garnett arrived at 6:30 as always. He set out the tools, poured coffee, and waited. 7 o'clock came and went. 7:30, 8. The gravel shoulder was empty. No sound of boots. No Shelby. Garnett dug alone for 2 hours. His back locked up after the first 40 minutes, and he had to kneel in the channel to keep shoveling, working from his knees like a man praying to the mud. By 9 o'clock, he knew something was wrong. Shelby hadn't missed a single day in 3 weeks. Not one. He drove to the trailer on Decker Road. It was a small place, single-wide paint peeling the metal steps rusted at the welds. Garnett knocked. No answer. Knocked again. Shelby opened the door. His eyes were red, not from crying, but from not sleeping. Behind him, the trailer was dim. Garnett could see empty beer cans on the counter, a phone lying face up on the table with a job listing website glowing on the screen. The listings were all in Des Moines. I think I should go, Shelby said. His voice was flat, emptied out. Megan texted last night. She's in Des Moines. Says there's an opening at the Amazon warehouse. $18 an hour. Benefits. Garnett stood on the rusted steps and looked past Shelby into the trailer. A blanket wadded on the sofa. Dishes in the sink. Bare walls with nothing on them except a nail where something had once hung and been taken down. The home of someone who had already started leaving before he made the decision to go. Megan, Garnett said, the one who left when you lost your job. At least it's steady work. Garnett was quiet for a moment. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He just said what he saw. Your father told you the same thing when he went to Kansas City, didn't he? Steady work. Going to send money. Going to make it right. Shelby's jaw tightened. His hand gripped the doorframe. You told me the first week that you promised yourself you'd never be the one who leaves. Those were your words, Shelby. I'm scared. It came out quiet, almost involuntary, like something squeezed from a stone. I'm scared I'll stay here forever and never become anything. Garnett looked at him. You already are something. You're the man who digs ditches in a swamp in October without complaining. You're the man who shows up at 7 every morning and works until he can't see. That's not nothing. Then Garnett turned, walked down the rusted steps, and got in his truck. He didn't look back. He didn't wait for an answer. He drove to the 40 acres and picked up his shovel and went back to work alone on his knees in the mud, his back screaming and his hands raw, and the clock counting down toward Bethel Presley's deadline. At 10:30, he heard boots on gravel. Shelby came down the bank with his shovel on his shoulder. His face was washed. His eyes were clear. He didn't say a word. He dropped into the channel, drove his blade into the earth, and started digging. Garnett didn't say anything either. They worked side by side until the light failed, and the silence between them was different now. It was the silence of something that had been tested and held. 6 days before Bethel Presley's deadline on a Tuesday morning in late October, Garnett was walking the property alone. He'd sent Shelby to town to pick up more PVC pipe from the hardware store. The morning was cold and still. The only sound was his boots on the drying mud, a sound that had changed over the weeks from the wet sucking of swamp to the firm crunch of earth, remembering what it used to be. He was headed for the spot the 1958 survey map had marked with a blue circle. He'd walked this route so many times on paper that his feet knew the way even through standing water and dead brush. 50 yards from the road, the ground changed. The mud was thinner here, the earth firmer underneath, and then he heard it. Water. Not the drainage channel, something different. A soft, steady bubbling like a pot, just beginning to simmer, coming from somewhere ahead and slightly to his left. Garnett walked faster. He rounded a stand of dying cattails and stopped. The ground opened up into a shallow depression about 4 feet across. Water was pushing up through cracks in the limestone bedrock, clear and cold, pooling in the depression before spilling over the edge and trickling south along a path it was carving for itself through the soft earth. The limestone was gray-white, streaked with mineral deposits that had been building for longer than anyone could calculate. The water caught the morning light and threw it back in fragments that danced across the mud and the dead cattails and the cold October air. Garnett stood there for a long time. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just looked at the spring and let it be real. Ottilie had described this exact spot 1,000 times. The water coming up through the rock, the mineral streaks on the limestone, the cold. She used to close her eyes when she talked about it, as though the telling required her to go back there, to stand barefoot on the wet stone and feel the chill climbing through her soles. Garnett had always listened. He just hadn't understood until now that she wasn't remembering a place. She was remembering who she'd been before time took it away. He knelt down and cupped his hands in the spring. The cold went through his skin and into his bones. He brought his hands to his lips and drank. The water tasted clean and mineral and old, like something that had been held underground for decades, patient and unchanged, just waiting for someone to clear the path so it could come home. Garnett sat down on a flat stone at the edge of the spring and stayed there until he heard Shelby's truck on the gravel. "Over here," Garnett called. Shelby picked his way across the drying mud and found Garnett sitting beside the spring. He looked at the water, then at Garnett, and whatever he saw in the old man's face told him that this was not just a hole in the ground with water coming out of it. "That's the spring?" Shelby asked quietly. Garnett nodded. "Been under there the whole time, 60 years. It's beautiful. My wife used to play here as a girl. Her grandmother brought her. They'd fill jars with the water and walk home through the grass." Shelby sat down on a rock across from Garnett. "She's the reason you bought the land. She asked me to bring it back. I just took too long getting started." They sat there together for a while, listening to the water. Then Shelby stood up, picked up his shovel, and asked the only question that mattered. What's next? They worked the area around the spring for the rest of that week, clearing debris, raking back decades of dead cattails and silt, giving the water room to flow. On Thursday afternoon, Shelby drove his shovel into the mud about 10 yards north of the spring and hit something solid. "Rock?" Garnett asked. Shelby scraped with the edge of his blade. More solid surface. He cleared a wider area. Flat. Too flat for natural stone. He was looking at hand-cut limestone blocks, each about 8 inches wide, laid in a straight line with crumbling mortar between them. "Garnett, come look at this." Garnett walked over and crouched down. A wall. A foundation wall built by someone who knew what they were doing. He ran his hand along the stones and felt the tool marks where someone had squared each block by hand. "Keep going," Garnett said. "Careful. Brush it clean. Don't dig into it." They switched to hand trowels and soft brooms, peeling back layers of mud, the way Garnett had seen archaeologists work on television. Whatever was under here had been buried for over 60 years, and he wasn't going to damage it with a shovel blade. By the end of the afternoon, they had exposed two walls meeting at a right angle. The structure had been roughly 20 feet by 15, built from the same limestone that the spring flowed through. The craftsmanship was solid, the work of someone who understood stone and respected it. The walls stood about 2 feet high. Then Shelby's trowel scraped across something different, a stone larger than the others set deeper into the foundation at the southeast corner, a cornerstone. Garnett brushed the surface clean with his fingers, blowing away loose dirt. The stone was about 12 inches square, and it was carved. Cut into its face, still legible after more than a century, were two lines. The first was a year 1887. The second was a pair of initials, M.H. Garnett sat back on his heels and stared at the carved letters. His hands were shaking, and it wasn't from the cold. M.H. Shelby read, 1887, you know who that is? He drove to the county library with mud still on his boots. The Historical Society archive was in the basement, one room with fluorescent lights and metal shelving. Property records, tax rolls, church registers, cemetery logs. Garnett found the transfer books for the 1880s and ran his finger down the pages. Section 12, Township 84 North, 40 acres, purchased from the federal government by Mertie Hamrick, March 15, 1886. Purchase price $1.25 per acre. Mertie Hamrick. Tax records showed her paying on the property from 1886 through 1902. After that, the land transferred to Orrin Hamrick, who Garnett guessed was her son. Orrin held it until 1928, when it was sold to a farmer named Ledbetter, who held it until the county flooded it in '63. Mertie Hamrick was Ottilie's great-grandmother. Ottilie had talked about her grandmother Zella, who was Mertie's daughter. Zella was the one who took Ottilie to the spring as a little girl. Zella was the one who told the stories about cold water and mason jars and walking through the tall grass. But Ottilie had never known that Mertie built the spring house. She had never known her own family once owned the land. The stories had thinned with each generation losing detail, the way a river loses water to evaporation, until by the time they reached Ottilie, all that was left was the spring itself and the memory of cold water on a summer afternoon. The name Mertie Hamrick, the initials on the cornerstone, the stone walls, all of it had been underwater for Ottilie's entire life. Garnett closed the record book and sat in the basement of the county library for a long time, listening to the fluorescent light buzz above him. The next morning, Shelby was clearing debris from a niche in the north wall of the foundation, the section where the spring water entered the structure, when his trowel clinked against something that wasn't stone. Glass. The lip of a glass jar sealed with a flat stone and what looked like old wax or pitch. A mason jar, the old kind, with a zinc lid and a rubber gasket. The glass was cloudy with age but unbroken. Inside, visible through the murky surface, was paper. Folded paper, yellowed but dry. Garnett pulled the jar out of the niche carefully. It was heavy. The seal was intact. Whatever was inside had been protected from water and air for a very long time. He reached inside and pulled out the folded paper. It was thick, good quality, the kind that lasted. He unfolded it carefully along the creases that were still sharp after more than a century. The letter was written in ink that had faded from black to brown. The handwriting was small, precise, and feminine. At the top, a date, September the 14th, 1887. Garnett read it aloud. His voice was low and steady, but Shelby could hear something moving underneath it, something that had been held down for a long time and was rising now, whether Garnett wanted it to or not. To whoever finds this place again. He paused. Shelby stood still. My name is Mertie Hamrick. I built this spring house with my husband Woodrow and our neighbor James Schuler in the summer of 1887. We built it over the spring because the spring belongs to everyone and we wanted to make sure it stayed that way. Garnett cleared his throat. His voice caught on the next line and he had to start it twice. The water is clean and cold and has never stopped flowing in the 12 years since we settled this land. Our children drink from it. Our neighbors fill their jugs here every Saturday. In winter, the spring never freezes, and in summer it keeps our milk and butter fresh when the heat would spoil them. He turned the letter over. The writing continued on the back. I do not know who will read this or when. Perhaps no one ever will, and this letter will sit in its jar until the stones crumble around it. But if you are reading this, then you found the spring, and that means something brought you here for a reason. This land has been good to us. I hope it will be good to whoever comes after. Garnett folded the letter along its original creases and held it against his chest. Shelby didn't say anything. He stood with his hands at his sides, watching Garnett hold a letter written by a woman who had been dead for more than 100 years. A woman whose great-granddaughter had spent her whole life dreaming about this exact spot without ever knowing the story buried in its walls. Ottilie would have loved this, Garnett said. His voice was rough. She spent her whole life talking about this spring, and she never knew her own great-grandmother built the walls around it. She never knew Mertie wrote a letter and sealed it in the stone. He looked at the water still coming through the limestone, steady and cold. I bought this land because Ottilie asked me to bring the spring back. I thought I was keeping a promise to my wife, but Ottilie's family was here first. They built this. They put the letter in the wall for someone to find, and somehow 137 years later, it was me. He stood up slowly, too slowly. The world tilted and he put his hand on the wall. His vision went gray at the edges. The ground seemed to shift. Garnett, Shelby grabbed his arm. Sit down. I'm fine. You're not fine. You went white. Sit down. Garnett sat. Shelby kept a hand on his shoulder until the color came back to the old man's face. When's the last time you ate? Breakfast. It's 4 in the afternoon. Shelby went to the truck and came back with water and the last granola bar from the glove box. Garnett drank and ate and felt the world settle back into place. The dizziness passed, but the weakness lingered. Deal, Garnett said before Shelby could say it. I'll eat lunch. You remind me. I'll remind you. Shelby drove the truck home that evening while Garnett sat in the passenger seat with Mertie's letter in his lap. At the house, Shelby made sure there was food in the refrigerator, then walked back toward his trailer. Garnett watched him from the kitchen window until he disappeared down the road. Then Garnett sat at the table. He set Mertie's letter on the left. He opened Ottilie's journal to the page about the spring and set it on the right. 2 women a century apart writing about the same water, the same stone, the same hope that someone would take care of what they loved. He touched the journal with one hand and the jar with the other. Your grandmother built it, Ottilie, he said to the empty room. She built the walls around your spring and put a letter in the stone. The clock ticked, the furnace hummed, and for the first time in 18 months, the silence didn't feel like absence. It felt like someone was listening. Before Shelby left for the night, he'd sat on the porch steps with Garnett for a few minutes. The cold was coming on and his breath made small clouds in the light from the kitchen window. Garnett listened without interrupting. When Shelby finished, Garnett said, "Then stay. There's plenty of work here." Shelby nodded. He stood up, stepped off the porch, and walked into the dark without saying goodbye. He didn't need to. He'd be back at 7. But while Garnett sat between those 2 letters that night, 137 years of silence finally broke and the story was already moving beyond his kitchen. Bethel Presley had gone home and told her husband about the spring. Her husband had mentioned it to a friend over coffee at the diner on Main Street. And Rayford Bumgarner, sitting one booth away with a cup of black coffee and the local newspaper, had overheard two words that made him set down his cup and listen very carefully. Natural spring, prime soil. Rayford finished his coffee, left a $5 bill on the table, and walked out to his SUV. He sat behind the wheel and made a phone call to a land appraiser he'd worked with for 15 years. "I need a rush assessment," Rayford said. "40 acres, Section 12, Township 84 North. Classified wetland, but the classification may be wrong. There's a natural spring on the property and what sounds like Class 1 soil underneath the water. I need a number by Friday." The appraiser called back Thursday afternoon. The number was $400,000, minimum. Rayford Bumgarner closed his laptop, picked up his phone, and called his attorney. Garnett Whitten had the spring and the letter in the soil, and a young man who'd chosen to stay. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't know yet, was that the man in the third row at the auction, the one who had written pass and moved on, had circled back. And this time Rayford Bumgarner was not going to pass. Rayford Bumgarner's black SUV pulled onto the gravel shoulder on a Wednesday morning in mid-November, and this time he didn't come alone. The man who stepped out of the passenger side wore a charcoal suit and carried a briefcase that looked like it had been to more courtrooms than most lawyers. Rayford was wearing his auction sport coat again, but his face had changed since October. The casual curiosity was gone. He looked like a man who had done his math and liked the answer. Garnett was kneeling by the spring, fitting a section of stone back into the north wall of the foundation where it had shifted during the last rain. Shelby was 20 yards away, stacking cedar posts for a fence line. They both looked up when the doors closed. Rayford walked across the drying ground with the confidence of a man who was used to owning whatever he stood on. The lawyer followed 2 steps behind, briefcase in one hand, the other hand adjusting his tie against the November wind. "Garnett," Rayford said. He smiled. It was the kind of smile that preceded an offer, warm on the surface and calculated underneath. "I wanted to come out and see what you've done here. It's impressive, really impressive." Garnett stood up, slowly brushing dirt from his knees. "What do you want, Rayford?" "I want to talk business." Rayford spread his hands, palms up, the universal gesture of reasonableness. "I had the property appraised. 40 acres, natural spring, Class 1 soil. You're sitting on something valuable, Garnett. I'm offering $50,000. That's 270 times what you paid. You walk away with a profit that most investors would kill for. $75,000. Not for sale." Rayford glanced at the lawyer, then back at Garnett, his smile thinned by a degree. He stepped closer and lowered his voice, as if what he was about to say was a kindness he was offering privately. "Garnett, I've spoken with your daughter, Eunice. She's concerned about you. She thinks this might be, and these are her words, not mine, a sign of cognitive decline. A 73-year-old man alone on a piece of land, refusing to recognize its market value. That's the kind of thing families notice. The kind of thing courts notice." The words settled over the property like frost. Shelby stopped stacking posts. The lawyer opened his briefcase and removed a manila folder, holding it at his side like a prop, waiting for its cue. Garnett looked at Rayford Bumgarner for a long moment. He looked at the lawyer with the folder. He looked at the SUV parked on the shoulder, clean and black and expensive, the vehicle of a man who made his living turning other people's land into other people's money. Then Garnett spoke, and his voice was the steadiest thing on the property. "You just used my daughter's grief to try to take my land. You called a woman who lost her mother 18 months ago and told her that her father is losing his mind because you want what's under his boots. That's not business, Rayford. That's something else." Rayford's smile disappeared. The lawyer shifted his weight. "You need to leave now," Garnett said, "and you need to not come back." Rayford held up his hands again, but the gesture had changed meaning. It was retreat now, not reasonableness. Just an offer, Garnett. I'll leave my card. He set a business card on the tailgate of Garnett's truck. Garnett picked it up, tore it in half, and put the pieces in his pocket. Rayford and the lawyer got back in the SUV and drove away without another word. Shelby walked over and stood next to Garnett. Neither of them spoke for a minute. Then Shelby said, "He's not done." "No," Garnett said, "he's not." Eunice arrived on a Saturday morning in early December. She didn't call ahead. She just showed up at Garnett's house at 8 o'clock in a rental car with a folder under her arm, and when she found the house empty, she drove out to the land. She would tell Garnett later that she'd come with a plan. She had printed articles about elderly financial exploitation. She had a list of assisted living facilities in Des Moines with availability and prices. She had rehearsed a speech about power of attorney and cognitive decline and a father's best interests. She had legal paperwork for a power of attorney designation downloaded from the internet and printed on her home printer, tucked into the back of the folder, behind everything else, the thing she was most ashamed of and most prepared to use. She was ready for a fight. She was ready to be firm. She was ready to do what she believed was the responsible thing for a father who had lost his way. She was not ready for what she found. Eunice pulled off the highway and stepped out of the car. The land she had seen in the aerial photographs online, 40 acres of gray water and dead cattails, was gone. In its place was something she did not have a category for. People were working the land, not one or two, at least 25 of them. A couple in matching canvas coats was building a raised bed near the fence line. A teenager was hauling compost in a wheelbarrow. An older man she recognized as Arlen Cornett was driving his tractor across the west field, turning the rough ground smooth. A woman from the church was planting something along the south wall of the stone foundation, her hands deep in the earth. And there, sitting on a wooden bench under the shelter next to the old stone walls, was her father. He was reading something to a group of small children who sat cross-legged on the ground in front of him. A young woman with a clipboard, their teacher, stood beside them. A school group, a field trip, to a garden that hadn't existed 3 months ago. Eunice stood beside the rental car and watched. Garnett held up a glass jar and pointed to the letter inside. The children leaned forward, their faces serious and curious in the way that children's faces get when they sense that something matters, even if they don't fully understand what. Garnett's voice was too far away for Eunice to hear, but she could see the way the children listened. She could see them reaching out to touch the carved cornerstone, tracing the letters and numbers with their small fingers. Something cracked open in Eunice's chest. She didn't know what to call it. Relief was part of it, shame was part of it. And underneath both of those, something larger and harder to name, the sudden understanding that she had built an entire theory about her father's mind based on a phone call and a price tag, and she had been wrong about all of it. She left the folder in the car. She walked down the gravel path to the shelter. Garnett saw her coming and stood up. He looked different from the last time she'd seen him at Thanksgiving a year ago, when he'd sat at the end of the table and barely spoken. He was thinner now, darker from weeks in the sun, but his eyes were clear and his back was straight, and he held himself the way she remembered from childhood, like a man who knew where he stood. "Eunice," he said, "you came. I came. Want to see the spring?" He led her around the stone walls to where the water emerged from the limestone. It was flowing steadily, pooling in a natural basin before spilling south along a channel that Shelby had lined with flat stones. Eunice knelt down and put her hand in the water. The cold went through her fingers and up her arm like an electric current. "Mom used to talk about this," Eunice said quietly. "All the time. I always thought she was exaggerating. You know how she was with stories. She'd tell you a fish was this big." She held her hands apart. "And then next time it was this big." She moved them wider. She wasn't exaggerating about the spring. Garnett showed her Mertie's letter. He showed her Ottilie's journal. He showed her the cornerstone with the date and initials, and he explained the connection he'd found in the county library. Mertie Hamrick Ottilie's great-grandmother, the woman who built the walls that held the spring. She closed the journal and pressed it against her chest and held it there. Mom never knew, Eunice said. She heard the stories from Grandma Zella. She came here as a little girl before the flooding. But the connection to Mertie, the spring house, the letter, all of that was already buried by then. She spent her whole life dreaming about a place her own family built, and she never knew it. Eunice spoke first. Garnett looked at his coffee. Were you going to do it? Eunice's eyes filled. I printed the paperwork, Dad. Power of attorney forms. They're in the folder in the car. I drove down here with a plan to convince you to sign them. Her voice broke and she didn't try to hold it together. I was scared. After Mom died, I kept waiting for you to fall apart, and then you bought a swamp, and I thought, this is it. This is how I lose him too. I thought I was protecting you. I was so sure I was right. You're not losing me, Eunice. I know that now. I watched you today. With those kids. With the people on the land. With Shelby. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I thought you were losing your mind. You were keeping a promise. Garnett looked out at the dark fields. Your mother asked me to bring the spring back. It took me too long, but I got there. It's beautiful, Dad. What you've done out there, Mom would have loved every minute of it. That's the idea. The next morning before Eunice left, she made a phone call from Garnett's kitchen. She used her real estate voice, the one that closed deals and ended negotiations, the voice that left no room for appeal. Mr. Boland, this is Eunice Slagle. I'm calling to inform you that you are not to contact me, my father, or any member of my family again regarding this property. The land is not for sale. It will never be for sale. Any further contact will be treated as harassment and referred to our family attorney with a formal complaint of elder exploitation. Do you understand? 2 weeks later, Rayford made one more play. A formal letter from his attorney arrived at Garnett's house offering $120,000 and suggesting that without a valid drainage permit, the county could force the restoration of the wetland classification, which would mean reflooding the land. Garnett took the letter to Arlen Cornett. Arlen read it at his kitchen table, folded it once, and set it down. He's threatening you. I know. What are you going to do? Talk to Bethel Presley. Garnett drove to the county building and sat down across from Bethel in her office. He laid 3 things on her desk: the 1958 survey map, a copy of the resolution, and Mertie Hamrick's letter in its mason jar. Bethel Rayford Bumgarner wants to buy this land and develop it. If he gets it, he'll pave over a spring that's been flowing since before this county existed. Mertie Hamrick built the walls around that spring in 1887. She wrote a letter and sealed it in the stone for whoever came after. My wife's family was on that land before anyone in this building was born. Bethel looked at the map. She looked at the resolution. Then she picked up the mason jar and read Mertie's letter through the glass, slowly, the way you read something that changes the weight of a decision you have already half made. She set the jar down and was quiet for a long time. I'll submit a recommendation to the board that the 1964 wetland classification be reviewed in light of the natural spring and the evidence that the flooding was caused by the county's own drainage reroute, she said. That supersedes the permit question. I'm not promising anything, but I'll submit it. Thank you, Bethel. She looked at him across the desk. My husband still thinks you were wrong about that boundary survey in '89. Garnett held her gaze. I wasn't. I know you weren't. It was not forgiveness exactly. It was something more practical than that. It was a woman choosing which side of a line she wanted to stand on and planting her feet. The board received Bethel's recommendation. They also received a letter signed by 23 families from the church organized by Pastor Wayman Darnell, who had visited the spring on a Tuesday afternoon in November and stood at the edge of the water for 10 minutes without speaking before turning to Garnett and saying, "This is the kind of thing we're supposed to protect." The letter asked the board to support the reclassification of the 40 acres as agricultural land. Rayford Bumgarner received copies of the board recommendation, the community letter, and a cease and desist notice from Eunice's attorney. He sat in his office in Des Moines, looked at the three documents, and did the only calculation that mattered. The land was protected. The family was united. The community was watching. There was no angle left. He closed the file and moved on to the next deal. The garden exploded that spring. Tomato plants stood chest-high in the raised beds by July, their branches bending under the weight of fruit, turning from green to red. Sweet corn in the west field grew taller than Shelby, the silk browning on the ears. Green beans climbed their poles. Zucchini sprawled between the rows. Pumpkins started to turn orange near the fence line, their vines spreading in every direction. The apple trees Garnett had planted in December, 15 saplings, Honeycrisp and Cortland, leafed out in May and doubled in size by August, their branches reaching wide over the south edge of the property. Still too young to bear fruit, but growing with a stubbornness that made Garnett smile every time he walked past them. Shelby and Arlen Cornett and a stonemason named Herschel, who drove over from Marshalltown, had rebuilt the spring house walls on Mertie's original foundation, matching her construction as closely as they could. The walls stood 3 feet high now, open at the top with a wooden shelter roof built from reclaimed barnwood and cedar posts. The spring flowed through the center of the structure exactly as Mertie had designed it, in one side and out the other. A brass plaque was mounted on the east wall. It read, "This land has been good to us. I hope it will be good to whoever comes after." Below the plaque, in a glass case Shelby had built, Mertie's original letter sat in its mason jar. Odell had filed the community land trust paperwork in February. The 40 acres were now legally protected from development, sale, or subdivision forever. Garnett was named steward for his lifetime, then Shelby as successor, then a board of community members. Odell had structured it so that even if every person involved moved away, the land could not be touched. "Nobody can build on it," Odell told Garnett when he presented the final documents. "Nobody can sell it. Nobody can drain the spring or plow the garden under. It stays as it is." "What did that cost?" "Filing fees, $47. Odell paused. $185 for the land, $47 for the trust, $232 total to protect 40 acres forever. Odell smiled, and when he did, his face became someone else's face entirely. Garnett had to look away for a moment. Shelby enrolled at the community college in Marshalltown in January evening classes in land surveying and geographic information systems. Garnett wrote the recommendation letter on a Saturday afternoon at his kitchen table, taking more time with it than he'd taken with anything he'd written in years. Shelby Petway has a natural understanding of terrain drainage and soil mechanics. In 8 months of working alongside him, I have watched him develop skills that took me years to learn. He reads land the way some people read music. He just needed someone to hand him the instrument. Shelby read the letter, folded it, and put it in his jacket pocket without a word. The next morning, he arrived 30 minutes early and spent the time before Garnett showed up recalibrating the transit. Clovis moved to a rented farmhouse 20 minutes from Garnett's place in March. He said it was for the quiet. He started helping at the garden on weekends. He built the benches along the path to the spring. He repaired the fence when deer pushed through in June. He strung the lights from pole to pole along the main path, the lights that made the garden glow on summer evenings like something painted from memory. Eunice started coming every other weekend in January. By spring, she had claimed a garden plot of her own, basil peppers and marigolds. She said the marigolds were for pest control, but Garnett knew she just liked how they looked. Her children came with her. Arletta, who was 9, appointed herself official guardian of the strawberry patch. Roland, who was 7, followed Shelby everywhere with a small shovel and questions about everything. On the last Saturday in August, the garden held its first harvest gathering. Garnett hadn't planned it as an event. He'd mentioned to Arlen that it might be nice for people to come by and pick whatever was ripe. Arlen told his wife told the church. Pastor Wayman mentioned it on Sunday. By 10 o'clock in the morning, there were 60 or 70 people on the property. Folding tables materialized from truck beds. Women set out dishes of potato salad and baked beans and corn casserole. Someone brought a cooler of lemonade. A man Garnett had never met was grilling burgers on a portable grill near the fence. Children chased each other through the orchard, their shouts carrying across the flat ground like birds. Around noon, someone asked Garnett to say a few words. He didn't want to. He had never been a speaker. Ottilie was the one who could talk to a room. Garnett was the one who measured things and wrote numbers on maps and kept his mouth shut. But people were looking at him, and the garden was full, and some moments ask you to be more than what you've always been. He stood by the spring house next to Mertie's letter in its glass case. Shelby stood to his left. Eunice, Clovis, and Odell stood to his right. Behind them, the garden stretched green and heavy with fruit, and the apple trees rustled in the warm breeze. "I'm not much for speeches," Garnett said, "so I'll keep this short." The crowd went quiet. The spring gurgled softly behind him. "My wife Ottilie grew up 2 miles from here. She used to come to this spring as a little girl with her grandmother. She told me about it the week we met, and she kept telling me about it for 52 years. She said somebody should bring it back." He paused. "When I bought this land last October, people thought I had lost my mind. My own kids thought so." A ripple of laughter. Clovis raised his hand. "Guilty." They weren't wrong to worry. A 73-year-old man buying 40 acres of swamp for $185, that does sound crazy. But I knew something about this land that nobody else remembered. I knew what was underneath. He looked at the garden, at the faces, at the spring. Some things are worth more than what you pay for them. I paid $185 for this land. What it gave back, I couldn't put a price on. It gave me my wife's spring. It gave me Mertie's letter. It gave me a reason to get out of bed in the morning when I wasn't sure I had one. His voice got rough, he cleared his throat, and it gave me all of you. So thank you for the seedlings and the fence posts and the Saturday mornings. Ottilie would have loved every minute of this. I know that for a fact because this is exactly what she always wanted. Garnett stepped back. People clapped. Someone whistled. Eunice was crying and she didn't care who saw. The afternoon stretched into evening. People ate and talked and walked the garden. Children fell asleep on blankets spread under the apple trees. The lights came on along the path as the sky darkened, turning the garden into something that looked like it had always been there, like the land had been waiting 60 years for someone to remember what it was supposed to become. One by one, families loaded their cars and headed home. Shelby stacked the folding tables and carried them to the shelter. Clovis picked up trash. Eunice wrapped leftover food. Odell collected the chairs. By 8 o'clock, the garden was empty except for Garnett. The night was warm and still. The stars were coming out not 1 or 2 at a time, but in waves the way they do in rural Iowa, where there are no city lights to argue with, where the sky is so wide and so deep that it makes you feel both very small and very held at the same time. Garnett walked the gravel path to the spring. His steps were slower than they'd been in October. His back talked to him in a language he understood better each month. His knees had their own opinions about gravel and cold and how many more seasons they'd cooperate. But his eyes were clear, his mind was sharp, and the path was one he could walk in the dark without thinking, because his feet had learned it the way they'd learned the hallway to his bedroom, the way they'd learned the route from the kitchen table to Ottilie's side of the bed, the routes that the body memorizes when the heart has walked them enough times. At the spring house, he found Shelby. The young man was sitting on the bench by the water with one of Garnett's old survey manuals open on his lap, reading by the light from his phone. He looked up when Garnett's boots crunched the gravel. "Thought you went home," Garnett said. "Wanted to finish this chapter, cadastral surveys, the way they divided the original public domain into sections and townships. That's how this land got its legal description. Section 12 Township 84 North. I looked it up. The original surveyor walked this section line in 1847 with a chain and a compass and two axemen cutting through tall grass prairie. Every property boundary in this county traces back to that one walk." Garnett sat down beside him. The bench was solid. Shelby and Clovis had built it from oak planks that Arlen Cornett had pulled from a barn he was dismantling on his North 40. The wood was old and dark, and it held the warmth of the day the way old wood does. "When I started at the county office in '69, Garnett said, there was an old surveyor named Delmer Sigmund who'd been doing the work since the '40s. He told me something my first day that I never forgot. He said the land was here before us and it'll be here after. Our job is just to write down what we see so the next person knows what they've got." Shelby closed the book. That's what Mertie did with the letter. She was writing down what she saw so the next person would know. Garnett looked at him. In 9 months, Shelby Petway had gone from a man walking a county road with nothing in his pockets and nowhere to be, to a man sitting beside a spring reading survey manuals by phone light because he couldn't wait until morning to learn what came next. Garnett had seen a lot of land transform in his career. He had never seen a person transform the same way from the inside out, the way soil comes back to life when you give it water and light and time. "You're going to be good at this," Garnett said. "The surveying, the land work. You have the eye for it. I had a good teacher. You had a stubborn old man who made you dig ditches in October." Shelby laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and doesn't apologize for the sound it makes. "Same thing." Garnett stood up. His knees protested, but they'd been protesting for years, and he'd learned to negotiate with them the way you negotiate with anything that's been part of your life long enough to have earned its complaints. He picked up Ottilie's garden journal from the bench where he'd set it that morning and tucked it under his arm. "Good night, Shelby." "Night, Garnett. See you Monday." "You'll see me tomorrow. Those tomatoes aren't going to pick themselves." Garnett walked back along the gravel path. The string lights swayed in a breeze so faint he could barely feel it on his face. The garden was dark except for those lights and the stars, and the air carried the smell of warm soil and ripe tomatoes and cut grass, the smell of late summer in Iowa, the smell of things reaching their fullness before the turn toward autumn. At the end of the path where the gravel met the county road, he stopped and turned around. The spring house was a soft shape in the darkness, its shelter roof a dark line against the stars. The garden beds stretched in their rows neat and full. The apple trees stood along the south edge, still young, still small, their branches reaching for something they wouldn't catch for years. But they were patient. Apple trees are patient. They understand that the work of growing happens slowly and that fruit comes to those who stay. Garnett opened Ottilie's journal. The pressed aster was still there, tucked between the pages about the spring. Its color had faded long ago. purple gone to brown, its petals so thin now that the starlight came through them. He didn't know when Ottilie had pressed it, maybe 40 years ago, maybe yesterday. Time does strange things to the objects that belong to the people we love. It preserves them and wears them away at the same time until what's left is not the thing itself, but the meaning it carries, light as a petal, heavy as a stone. He touched the flower gently with his thumb. Then he looked up at the land. His land, Ottilie's land, Mertie's land, 40 acres that nobody wanted, that everybody laughed at, that a retired surveyor bought for less than the cost of the boots he was wearing. And that turned out to be worth more than anyone in the county could have imagined. Not because of the soil, though the soil was extraordinary, not because of the spring, though the spring was beautiful, but because it was the place where a promise made in a quiet room to a dying woman was finally, after too many years and too many silent evenings, kept. "Found it, Ottilie," he said quietly. "Just like you said, the prettiest 40 acres in the county." The spring flowed. The garden held its breath in the summer darkness. On the bench by the water, Shelby turned the page and kept reading. And across the flat Iowa night, the sound of the spring carried the way it had carried for 100 years before Garnett Whitten, and the way it would carry for 100 years after. Steady and old and patient. The sound of water that had waited 60 years underground and had finally been given a path back to the surface. The sound of something that endures. Some promises take a lifetime to keep, but the best ones are worth every year you spend getting there.